The doctors had already given up trying to reason with him. They stood in the rain, syringes in hand, watching the most feared man in Korea bleed out on a mountain road, and refused to be saved. His bodyguards were on their knees begging. His personal physician was crying. And Lee Hyun-jae sat against the wreck of his overturned SUV with his eyes open, his jaw clenched, and 3 words on his lips that would stop every person around him cold.
Let me die.
That was the moment Eliana Caldwell stepped through the crowd. Nobody knew who she was. Nobody had called her. And nobody could explain why. When every trained doctor had failed to reach him, a quiet African nurse knelt in the mud beside a dying crime lord and said something so simple, so impossible, that it made him change his mind. What she said and why it worked is a story that begins more than 20 years before that rainy mountainside. And it will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about destiny, debt, and the quiet power of a promise kept. Before we go further, we'd love to know, where are you watching from right now? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you're new here, click that subscribe button so you never miss stories like this one. To understand what happened on that road outside Seoul, you have to understand the 2 people who met there. And to understand them, you have to go back. Not to the accident. Not to the hospital. You have to go back to the silence that shaped both of them long before they ever crossed paths. Lee Hyun-jae grew up in a house that smelled like cigarette smoke and leather. His father, Lee Sung-min, ran one of Seoul's oldest and most respected underground networks, a man who moved between business suits and backroom deals with equal comfort. He was not cruel in the way people imagine crime lords to be cruel. He was precise, measured. He had a philosophy. Power is not taken. It is maintained. And the first way you maintain it is by never letting anyone see you bleed. Hyun-jae watched his father live that principle every day. He watched it work. And then, when Hyun-jae was 16 years old, he watched his father die, not from a rival's bullet, but on an operating table, after a sudden cardiac event that the doctors said they should have been able to manage. They weren't. Lee Sung-min went in for a routine procedure and came out in a body bag. Hyun-jae sat in that hospital waiting room for 9 hours. When the doctor finally came out with that look on his face, something in Hyun-jae quietly closed. Not in a dramatic, cinematic way. In the slow, permanent way that a door seals when the frame warps. You don't notice it until one day you try to open it again and realize it no longer moves. He buried his father. He took over the organization at 17. And from that day forward, he never set foot inside a hospital again. By the time he turned 40, Lee Hyun-jae was not just feared, he was mythologized. People in Seoul's financial and criminal underworld spoke about him the way people speak about weather. Not with admiration. With the resignation you reserve for forces you cannot negotiate with. He controlled shipping routes, silent stakes in legitimate businesses, and a network of informants so deeply embedded in government that 6 careers had quietly ended at his suggestion. He had survived 3 assassination attempts, 2 car bombs, 1 poisoning. He had never, in 23 years of running his empire, been admitted to a hospital. And the people around him had learned not to raise the subject. What they hadn't learned, what nobody around him ever saw, was that none of it made him feel alive. He had everything that was supposed to matter, and he felt nothing. He hadn't slept a full night in years. He didn't eat meals so much as he consumed calories because his body required it. Twice, in the hours before dawn when the building was quiet, his personal assistant had heard him speaking in his office. Not on the phone. Just speaking, softly, to someone who wasn't there. The assistant never asked who. He had been with Hyun-jae long enough to know the answer would be the name of a girl who had died on an operating table 14 years ago. Hyun-jae's younger sister, Sun-hee, who had gone in for a heart procedure at 22 and never come back out. Hyun-jae didn't just distrust hospitals. He believed, in some quiet, unreachable part of himself, that hospitals were where the people he loved went to be taken from him. First his father, then Sun-hee. He had stopped letting people get close enough to be the third.
Now,
Eliana Caldwell. She grew up in Atlanta, Georgia, in a house that always had music playing and somebody's aunt in the kitchen. Her father, Dr. James Caldwell, was a physician who spent a third of every year overseas doing humanitarian medical work, Uganda, South Sudan, parts of Southeast Asia, places where a doctor with a bag and a generator could make the difference between a village that survived and one that didn't. Her mother, Renee, was an ER nurse who worked double shifts and still had energy at the end of the day to sit at the kitchen table and help Eliana with her homework. Eliana didn't choose medicine so much as she was raised inside it the way other children are raised inside religion. It was the language of her household. It was what you did when someone needed help. You showed up. You didn't ask questions about whether they deserved it. You showed up. She became a trauma nurse at 26, one of the youngest charge nurses in her hospital's ICU history at 29, and by 34 she had a reputation, not for speed, not for clinical brilliance, though she had both, but for something harder to quantify. She had a way of reaching patients who had stopped cooperating, patients who had pulled out their IVs, patients who were screaming or refusing or simply lying in the bed with their face to the wall, waiting to be left alone to die. She didn't argue with them. She didn't lecture.
She sat down.
She talked to them like they were people who had reasons for what they were doing. And more often than not, they started cooperating. Her colleagues called it her gift. She called it basic respect. People know when you're performing care, she had once told a resident she was mentoring. They know when it's a protocol you're running through. If you want them to trust you, you have to actually see them.
Not their chart. Them.
She had been in Seoul for 6 weeks when the accident happened. She was there through an international emergency medical exchange program, a 6-month rotation at a large trauma center in the city. She had arrived knowing almost no Korean, armed with a translation app and a worn leather notebook that had belonged to her grandmother, filled with handwritten folktales and prayers, and, tucked inside the back cover, a single faded letter she had been carrying for 11 years. The call came in at 11:47 p.m. on a Thursday in October. A vehicle had gone off a mountain road 40 minutes outside the city. Multiple casualties. One critical. The hospital mobilized a full trauma response, and Eliana, who was on a late shift covering for a colleague, climbed into the second vehicle of the medical convoy without knowing yet whose car had gone off the road. She found out when they arrived, and one of the Korean paramedics said the name. She knew it. Not the way you know a celebrity's name, but the way you know a name you've been carrying in your back pocket for over a decade. Her hands, which were steady in every operating room, every crash cart moment, every code blue, trembled for exactly 4 seconds. Then she made them stop. She picked up her bag and she walked through the rain toward the wreck. The scene was controlled chaos. 3 bodyguards were either injured or kneeling in the road. A 4th was pressed against the overturned SUV, speaking rapidly to the man leaning against it. 4 doctors and 2 paramedics were standing at a distance that made no clinical sense, close enough to rush in, but stopped as if they had hit an invisible wall. Eliana understood why when she got close enough to hear what Hyun-jae was saying. He wasn't screaming. He wasn't panicking. He was quiet and calm and absolutely certain. "Don't touch me." His Korean was directed at the medical staff. "Back away." One of the paramedics tried again to approach with a stabilization collar, and Hyun-jae turned his eyes on the man with a look so flat and absolute that the paramedic physically stepped back. He was bleeding from a gash above his left eye. His breathing was shallow in a way that told Eliana, even from 10 feet away, that at least 2 ribs were compromised and possibly a lung. He was going to die. Not eventually.
Soon. And he knew it.
And he had apparently decided that was acceptable. Eliana set her bag down on the wet road. She didn't push past anyone. She just walked forward at a pace that was neither fast nor slow, and she lowered herself to the ground beside him until they were at eye level. He looked at her. There was no fear in his expression, just a kind of distant calculation, like he was deciding whether to acknowledge her or not. "You're the only nurse who came," he said. In English. He had clocked her immediately. Everyone else sent doctors.
"Doctors argue," she said.
"I don't." She looked at him the way she looked at all her patients. Directly. Not at the blood. Not at the chest that was working too hard. At his face. "You've been inside a hospital before," she said quietly. "And you lost someone there." He didn't answer. "I know that feeling," she said. I know exactly what it is to sit in a waiting room and have a doctor come out and rearrange your whole life with one sentence. I know what it means to decide after that hospitals are places where people go to be taken from you. His jaw tightened. I'm not asking you to trust the hospital, she said. I'm asking you to trust the next 4 hours. That's all. 4 hours. And I will stay with you every single minute of them. She paused. Your father once saved my life. Let me save his son's. The silence lasted exactly 6 seconds. She counted them. Then Hyun-jae exhaled. Not a sigh of defeat, but the slow release of a man setting down something he had been holding for a very long time.
4 hours, he said.
4 hours, she said. Starting now. If you've ever watched someone who is used to controlling everything suddenly be placed in a position where they control nothing, you understand the next 48 hours. Hyun-jae was moved into surgery within 20 minutes of arriving at the trauma center. Internal bleeding in his abdomen, 2 fractured ribs, a hairline fracture in his C4 vertebra that had come terrifyingly close to severing his spinal cord, and a mild traumatic brain injury. The surgeon's post-operative report said, without exaggeration, that another 20 minutes on that road would have killed him. He survived the surgery. And when he came out of anesthesia in the ICU, the first thing he did, before he asked where he was or what had happened or how long he had been under, was turn his head slowly to the left. Eliana was there. She hadn't left. She was sitting in the chair beside his bed with her grandmother's notebook open on her lap, and when she looked up and saw his eyes were open, she said only, still counting, "You got about 2 hours left on your 4. Something moved across his face that his personal assistant, who had been pacing in the corridor for 6 hours, would not have recognized as a smile. But it was. The next 3 days were tense in ways that had nothing to do with his injuries. His organization sent security immediately, 12 men rotating in pairs outside his room, a request that the floor be cleared of other patients, a demand from his chief of staff that the hospital's camera footage from the corridor be handed over. The hospital administrator was visibly sweating. Hyun-jae's lead surgeon, a meticulous man named Dr. Park who had treated enough powerful people to stay calm around them, negotiated a compromise. 2 security personnel inside the ward at all times, cameras reviewed jointly by his team and the hospitals. No other patients moved unless medically necessary. Hyun-jae, who was still on significant pain medication and mostly horizontal, overruled his own chief of staff and accepted Dr. Park's terms. The nurse stays, was all he added. Nobody argued with that. Eliana stayed on an extended rotation. Her supervising physician signed off without hesitation, partly because she was good and they needed her, and partly because even the Korean medical staff had worked out, within about 12 hours, that this patient was cooperating with exactly one person, and any attempt to interfere with that dynamic would complicate everyone's lives.
She did her job.
She monitored his vitals, managed his pain protocol, supervised his respiratory therapy for the bruised lung. And in the hours between, when the ward was quiet and his security men stood silently at the door, she talked to him. Not about his injuries. Not about his organization or his history, or the questions that were already circulating in Seoul's financial press about who had arranged the accident and why. She talked to him the way her grandmother had talked to her when she was small and couldn't sleep about things. About the folk tales in her notebook. About her father's work in Africa. About a village in South Sudan where the only hospital for 40 miles was a converted schoolroom with 3 functioning cots and a generator that ran on prayers and diesel, and where her father had spent 4 months delivering babies and setting bones and treating infections that in any other context would have been a 15-minute clinic visit. Hyun-jae listened. He didn't talk much in those first days. Partly pain, partly the natural reserve of a man who had spent decades performing authority, but he listened in the focused way of someone for whom real conversation had become so rare that it felt like a foreign substance his body didn't quite know how to process. On the 4th night, at around 2 a.m, she heard him say a name in his sleep. She was charting quietly at the small desk near his bed. She heard it clearly, son. She didn't write it down. She didn't ask about it in the morning. But she heard it. And she understood. If this story is hitting you somewhere deep right now, pause for a second and drop a comment. What part of this story is staying with you? And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. There is so much more of this story left, and you do not want to miss what comes next. By the end of the first week, the investigation into the accident had produced something that nobody in Hyun-jae's inner circle was prepared to say out loud, even though they had all privately suspected it since the night it happened. The crash was not an accident. The vehicle's braking system had been compromised, a clean, professional job, the kind that required access to the garage, access to the car's maintenance schedule, and access to information about the route Hyun-jae would take that night, which only 7 people had known in advance. The investigation, run quietly by Hyun-jae's head of internal security, a man named Taewon, who had the eyes of someone who had spent 30 years seeing things he could never unsee, narrowed to 3 names within 72 hours. And one of those names was someone who had been with Hyun-jae's organization for 11 years. Hyun-jae received the preliminary report in his hospital bed on day 8. Eliana watched him read it from across the room. She watched the stillness that came over him. Not shock, because she didn't think this man was easy to shock, but something more complex. The particular stillness of a person who has spent years being careful and has just been shown where the careful wasn't enough. He folded the report. He handed it back to Taewon. He said, very quietly, "Find the other 2. Don't touch anyone until I'm out of here." Taewon left. Hyun-jae sat without moving for a long time. Then he said, not looking at her, "How do you do that?" "Do what?" "Sit in rooms with people who have done terrible things and not flinch." She was quiet for a moment. "Because the worst thing I can do for a patient is decide I already know who they are before I hear their breathing." He looked at her then. "That's not an answer." "It is," she said. "You just have to sit with it for a while." The danger that week was real and specific. Someone had leaked Hyun-jae's hospital location. Not difficult to find given the security presence, but still a signal that the people behind the crash had sources inside the building or close enough to it. 2 anonymous messages were delivered to the nurse's station on Eliana's floor. Neither was addressed to anyone by name. The first said, "You've done enough. Leave." The second said something worse. She didn't leave. She showed them to hospital security and to Taewon, who had both messages analyzed within 6 hours. She went back to her shift. One of the younger nurses asked her that evening if she was scared. She thought about it honestly. "Yes," she said. "But being scared isn't a reason to stop." The younger nurse looked at her like she had said something impossible. Eliana understood. When she was 22, she had thought the same thing. Hyun-jae found out about the messages on the same day Taewon did. He called her into his room, not summoned, not demanded, but asked, through the nurse's station, if she had a few minutes when she was free.
She went in.
He was sitting up in bed, which was new. His recovery was accelerating faster than the surgical team had projected, and he looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not the controlled authority of a man managing a situation. Something closer to discomfort. "You received warnings," he said. "Yes." "You should go." "I gave you 4 hours," she said. "And then I gave you more. I'm not in the habit of pulling my word back once I've given it." He was quiet. "That's either very principled or very foolish," he said. "My grandmother would have said those 2 things are the same," she replied. Something in his expression shifted. "Your grandmother sounds like someone who made things difficult for people around her." "Consistently," Eliana said. "She also lived to 94, so." He looked away. But she saw it. The smallest curve at the corner of his mouth. The second one she had seen from him in 8 days. She kept count because each one felt like data, proof that there was something in there that hadn't completely closed. Physical therapy started on day 11. The spinal fracture had not required surgical fusion, which was the best possible outcome, but it meant that recovery was dependent on controlled, consistent, disciplined movement, none of which were things that came naturally to a man who had spent decades issuing instructions rather than receiving them. The physiotherapist assigned to Hyun-jae was a mild-mannered woman named Dr. Yu who, to her enormous credit, treated him exactly the same way she treated all her patients, with calm, factual, unimpressed professionalism. He hated her sessions. He completed every one. Eliana checked in during the afternoon sessions, not to supervise but to observe, and occasionally to recalibrate the room's temperature when she noticed his jaw setting in the particular way it set when he was approaching his limit, and didn't plan to say so. She had learned to read him the way she learned to read all her long-term patients, not by what they said, but by the things they tried not to show. He was in significant pain that he minimized in every report. He was sleeping less than his charts reflected because he had learned to appear asleep when the night shift nurses came by. He woke, without exception, somewhere between 3 and 4 in the morning, and he sat in the dark and looked at the ceiling, and sometimes spoke too quietly to make out the words. On the night of day 13, she adjusted her rounding schedule and was in the corridor outside his room at 3:15 a.m. She heard him clearly through the partially open door. He was talking to Sun-hee. Not dramatically. The way you talk to someone you know isn't there, but you can't quite stop addressing anyway. "I don't know what I'm doing here," he said. "You would have known. You always knew what things were supposed to look like." A pause. "She reads to me from a notebook. These stories, you'd like them. They sound like something you would have collected." Eliana stood in the corridor for a moment longer than she should have. Then she moved on. She started leaving the notebook on the chair beside his bed during her off hours. She told him he could read it if he couldn't sleep. He didn't acknowledge this the first time. The second time, when she came in the next morning and picked it up, the pages were open to a different place than she had left them. She didn't comment. On the third morning, he said, without preamble, the story about the river and the two brothers. "Who told your grandmother that?" She said her own grandmother told her. Eliana said that it was old before she was born. "It's similar to a Korean story," he said. "The details are different, but the shape is the same. My father always said people are more similar than geography wants us to believe," she said. He considered this. "Then, your father, he worked in Africa." "Most of his career, yes. Humanitarian medicine. My whole childhood, really." "Which countries?" She listed several. His expression didn't change, but something in his posture shifted, very slightly, in the way that a room shifts when a window is open somewhere out of sight. You don't see it. You feel it in the air. The attack came on day 16. A power failure hit the floor at 2 a.m., not the whole hospital, just the west wing where Hyun-jae's room was located, which was enough to tell Taewon's team immediately that it was engineered. The backup generators kicked in within 90 seconds, but 90 seconds is a long time. One of Hyun-jae's two inside guards was outside the room, positioned poorly in retrospect, and the man who came in through the service corridor got as far as the foot of Hyun-jae's bed before Eliana, who had been in the room on a late check, stepped between them. She did not do this because she was brave. She did it because her body moved before her mind had completed the sentence. The man hesitated. He had not expected a nurse. Taewon's team arrived within the next 40 seconds. The situation was contained. Eliana had a bruised forearm where she had deflected something in the dark. She didn't realize how badly until the lights came back on and Hyun-jae, who was halfway out of his hospital bed in a way that his surgical team would have described as a medical emergency in itself, looked at her arm and went completely still. "Sit down," she said to him. "You'll tear the sutures." "You're bleeding," he said. "It's minor."
"Sit down."
He sat. Not because he was following orders, because the look on her face left no room for argument. She let the attending physician treat the laceration. She accepted the mild sedative the on-call doctor recommended for shock. She didn't feel shocked, but she was professional enough to understand that her own assessment of her state wasn't reliable at 2 a.m. after being hit in the dark. And then she sat in the chair beside Hyun-jae's bed because she was honestly too tired to walk to the break room, and she closed her eyes. When she opened them, it was 5 a.m. Hyun-jae was awake. Her grandmother's notebook was open on his lap. Not in the place she had left it. He was near the back. He was reading the letter. She had forgotten, or perhaps somewhere underneath everything, she had not forgotten at all, that the letter was tucked inside the back cover. She had carried it for so long that it had become like a physical part of the book, indistinguishable from the notebook itself in her mind. She watched him read it. She watched the exact moment it landed. The stillness that came over him was different from every other stillness she had seen from him. This was not control. This was something hitting bedrock. He looked up. His eyes were, she had never seen this, in 16 days, wet. Not tears. The particular shine of a man holding tears back with everything he has. The letter, he said. You know who sent it? I know the name, she said.
Lee.
I didn't know which Lee until I saw your ring. The family crest. She had seen it on his right hand the night of the accident. Kneeling in the mud beside him with the rain coming down, she had seen the crest on the ring and recognized the same design from the seal on the letter she had carried since she was 23 years old.
Tell me, he said.
She told him. When Eliana was 12 years old, her father was part of a medical mission in South Sudan that ran into serious logistical trouble, supply lines cut, funding frozen. The team stranded in a region where 300 children were at critical risk from a disease outbreak. The mission had been days from collapse when an anonymous wire transfer arrived, enough to fund the entire mission for another 4 months, cover medications, and bring in 2 additional physicians. Her father never found out who sent it. The organization that managed the mission knew only that it came from a private donor in South Korea through a foundation, under a family name, Lee. Eliana's father had written about it in a letter he sent home to his family. She had found the letter in his things after he died, when she was 23. She had kept it. She had carried it with her through 2 hospitals for cities and 1 international medical exchange. I didn't know his first name, she said. I didn't know if I would ever find out. I came to Korea for the rotation, and I thought, she stopped. I thought maybe it would give me something. A connection to something my father loved. I wasn't expecting to find him. You found his son, Hyun-jae said. Yes. He looked at the letter again. At the character of his family's name written in his father's hand, in a document that had traveled from South Korea to South Sudan to Atlanta, Georgia, and back. He never told me, Hyun-jae said. He did things quietly, she said. Like people who don't need to be thanked. He was silent for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was lower and rougher than she had ever heard it. Son, he would have found this, he stopped. Tried again. She would have said it was meant. Eliana said nothing. She understood the weight of that sentence, and she let it exist without reducing it. After a moment, she reached out and put her hand over his, the way she would for any patient who was carrying something too heavy to carry alone.
He did not move away.
The room was very quiet. Outside, Seoul was beginning to lighten. Somewhere down the corridor, a monitor beeped twice and went silent. Lee Hyun-jae, a man who had not cried since his sister's funeral, lowered his head. And he wept, quietly, without performance. The way people cry when they are finally somewhere safe enough to do it. If this moment got you, you are not alone. This is exactly what this channel is here for, stories that make you feel something real. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it today. And comment the word promise if you're still here with us. Let's see who made it this far. The traitor was identified before Hyun-jae was discharged. A man who had been with the organization for 9 years, not 11. Taewon had been off by 2 years, which he reported to Hyun-jae with the precise discomfort of a man who takes accuracy seriously. The other 2 involved were external, members of a rival financial group who had decided that the disruption of Hyun-jae's hospitalization was their best window in years. It was not handled violently, which surprised several people who knew Hyun-jae's history. The traitor was removed from the organization and handed, along with documentation, to a law enforcement contact whose cooperation had been maintained for years precisely for situations like this one. The rivals were sent a message, not threatening, just precise, that outlined what Hyun-jae knew, what he could prove, and what the consequences of further action would be. It was the response of a man who was thinking differently than he had been 3 weeks before. Taewon noticed. He said nothing. He filed it away. Hyun-jae was discharged on day 22. His recovery was projected to take another 4 months of outpatient physical therapy. He asked, through his assistant, whether Eliana would be willing to continue as his primary care contact through the outpatient period. She agreed. Her rotation had another 4 months on it. The timing was, depending on how you chose to interpret it, either coincidence or something else entirely. 6 months later, the changes Hyun-jae made to his organization were not sudden, and they were not announced. He moved quietly, the way he had always moved, but in different directions. He began divesting from the parts of his network that operated in legal gray areas, slowly and methodically, in a way that his attorneys said was the most disciplined restructuring they had seen in 30 years of practice. He invested instead in infrastructure, specifically in healthcare, a new trauma center in a district of Seoul that had been historically underserved. Funding for an international medical scholarship program that specifically supported connections between Korean and African medical practitioners. A donation to a humanitarian medicine foundation that his research had identified as one of the most effective organizations of its kind in the world, the same organization, as it happened, that his father had donated through 2 decades before. He did not publicize any of it. When a journalist connected one of the donations to him and reached out for comment, his publicist replied with a single sentence, "Mr. Lee prefers his actions to speak for themselves." The hospital's new emergency wing was named after Lee Sun-hee. At the small, private naming ceremony, Hyun-jae stood in front of the plaque with his hands in his pockets, and his jaw doing the thing it did when he was holding something in. Eliana stood a few feet away. After a moment, he said quietly without looking at her, "She would have been embarrassed. By the wing. By all of it. The attention. She hated fuss. But she would have liked the name of the thing the fuss was for," Eliana said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, yes. She would have liked that. He looked at the plaque for a long time. And then he straightened. And he let out a breath. And something in the line of his shoulders was different than it had been 7 months ago on a mountain road. Lighter, somehow, and more settled, as if the weight was still there but was finally being carried the right way. Eliana's rotation ended the following month. She made arrangements to extend it by 6 months. She did not make a large announcement about this. She simply filed the paperwork and told her supervisor she wasn't ready to leave yet. Her supervisor, who had watched this particular situation unfold from an institutional distance and had a great deal of professional respect for Eliana and a great deal of practical wisdom about when not to ask questions, approved the extension without comment. Their relationship did not move quickly. It moved honestly, which is different and rarer and harder. There were conversations in hospital corridors and in the car on the way to outpatient appointments and, eventually, over dinner at a restaurant he chose because it was quiet and she chose because she had read a review that said the fish was extraordinary. There were silences that were comfortable and silences that were working through something real. There were moments when his old reflexes, the distance, the control, the instinct to retreat behind authority when things got close, came back up, and she recognized them for what they were without treating them as personal. And there were moments when something she said about her father, about her grandmother, about what she believed about people and their capacity to change, landed somewhere in him that she could see, but couldn't quite name. He trusted her. Not because he had decided to, not because he had reasoned his way into it. Because she had earned it. One kept word at a time. And for a man who had stopped believing that trust was possible, that was everything. Here's what stayed with people who heard this story. Not the crime lord who changed. Stories about powerful people having revelations are common enough. What stayed with people was Eliana. The woman who received an anonymous act of generosity as a child, carried the trace of it for 2 decades, traveled to a country where she knew nobody, and ended up kneeling in the rain next to the son of the man who saved her, with no guarantee that it would work, no way of knowing if he would respond, and no reason beyond her own conviction that the debt was real and the moment was right. She didn't know it would go the way it did. She didn't know he would listen. She knelt in the mud, and she said what was true, and she meant every word of it. And it was enough. Not because the words were perfect. Because she was. Because she had spent her whole life preparing to be exactly who she was in that moment, someone who showed up, said the true thing, and stayed. Think about someone in your life who kept a promise when they didn't have to. When it cost them something. When it would have been easier, quieter, safer to walk away. Think about what that did to you. Think about whether you've been that person for someone else. The promise Eliana made on that mountain road was not about medicine. It wasn't really even about Lee Hyun-jae. It was about a 12-year-old girl in South Sudan who survived because someone somewhere decided her life was worth the cost of saving, and who spent the next 22 years deciding, every single day, that she would be the kind of person who would do the same. Some people survive because doctors save them. Others survive because someone reminds them their life still has meaning. And some people, the rarest kind, live because someone they've never met once decided, in a moment they'll never remember, that the world would be better with them in it. If this story stayed with you, if it made you think about someone, or feel something you needed to feel, share it. Send it to the person who came to mind. Comment below and tell us what part of this story hit you hardest. Was it Eliana's faith that she would find who she was looking for? Was it Hyun-jae finally letting himself be saved? Was it the idea that one act of generosity, given quietly and without expectation, can travel through 2 decades and 2 continents and still find its way home? We want to hear from you. And if you're not subscribed yet, do it now. We put everything we have into every story on this channel, and the next one is something we think you're not going to be able to stop watching. Every scar,